This session is sponsored by the Hillsdale K-12 Education Office. The mission of the Hillsdale College K-12 Education Office is to promote the founding of classical schools and excellence in their teaching and operations, to the end that the American students may be educated in the liberal arts and sciences and receive instruction in the principles of moral character and civic virtue. In addition to using the Hillsdale K-12 program guide, Hillsdale College member schools receive ongoing support and training in the 5 best practices of board governance, school leadership, curriculum, classroom instruction, and school culture. Hillsdale College does not own, manage, or govern its affiliated schools, and all assistance from the Hillsdale K-12 Education Office is given free of charge. One more slide, I'm sorry about that. The Hillsdale College K-12 Education Office is the publisher of Literacy Essentials, The Journey from Spelling to Reading, which is a comprehensive K-3 literacy program combining the strong foundation of an Orton-based literacy instruction. Some of you, your ears should have poked up, because if you're in science of reading, you know of Orton. With an attractive and engaging format. The college is currently assisting 30 member schools and 11 founding efforts nationwide, and an additional 49 charter and private schools are licensees of its curriculum. Our speaker today is Robert Pondiscio. He is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and an affiliate of said institute's James Q. Wilson program in K-12 education studies, where he focuses on K-12 education, curriculum, teaching, school choice, and charter schooling. Before joining AEI, Mr. Pondiscio was a policy analyst and education reform expert at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, which is an education policy think tank. He previously worked for the Core Knowledge Foundation as an advisor and civics teacher at Democracy Prep Public Schools. Mr. Pondiscio became interested in educational policy issues when he started teaching the best grade, which is 5th grade, at a struggling South Bronx public school in 2002. Before that, he worked in journalism. I didn't know that, my husband's a journalist, for 20 years, including senior positions at Time and Business Week. Mr. Pondiscio is the author of many books, including How the Other Half Learns, Equality Excellence, and the Battle Over School Choice, which is about success charter schools, and was widely reviewed and praised. Without further ado, I'd like to turn the time over to Robert Pondiscio.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Good afternoon. Let's start by playing a game. I'm going to tap out the rhythm of a famous song, and I'm not trying to fool you. It will be a song that you know. Your job is to listen to my taps and identify the song. Okay? Let's try it. Here we go. That's the entire first verse, and it is... Thank you. God bless America. Come on, you knew that, right? You're just being shy. Really? Okay, let's try another one. Even simpler song. Ready? All together. Twinkle, twinkle, little star. Why is everybody else not calling out? Come on, I'm giving you permission. You knew it was Twinkle, Twinkle, right? You didn't. Okay, I'm having a little bit of a laugh at your expense. I know you didn't get it. 20 years ago, there was a Stanford graduate student by the name of Elizabeth Newton. She did her dissertation on that game that I just did with you. And she was a psychology student, and she discovered something remarkable. Given a list of 25 well-known songs to tap out, the listener's success rate was only 2.5%, which was probably about what we had here, like 1 or 2 out of 40. But that's not what was interesting about the experiment. As part of the experiment, she asked the person doing the tapping to predict the success rate. How successful would you be at communicating the song? And the tappers predicted 50%, like half of people would get it. So why that disconnect? Why is this so hard? Well, in this game, the tapper, me, I'm hearing the words, I'm hearing the music, I'm hearing orchestration. What are you hearing? Tap, 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 tap. The tapper cannot understand why the listener doesn't get it. The listener, you, doesn't understand why I think you should. So what makes the game so hard is that you're getting accurate information, but it's impartial information, right? I know the song title, you don't, and I can't remember what it's like for you to not have that information. This is sometimes referred to as the curse of knowledge. Once we know something, we find it impossible to imagine what it's like to not know that thing anymore. Our knowledge has cursed us. So as a listener, what makes the game hard is because even though you're getting valid information, it's incomplete. You're not getting the whole song. You try to fill in the gaps, right? I'm guessing that's what you were thinking, trying to imagine, fill in the gaps in your knowledge. But you don't know what I know. You don't know which song it was. So the reason I love this game, it's as good a model as you're likely to find as to why background knowledge is the key to reading comprehension. Writers make assumptions about readers' background knowledge, and usually it works. But for struggling readers, what's on the page, just like the taps, it's useful, but it's not enough. It's incomplete. So that's the curse of knowledge. So I want to address a few topics with you in the next half hour or so. Why knowledge matters, why reading is not a skill. Trust me on this one. That's counterintuitive. I'll take you along. Why there's really no such thing as a reading test. Mostly what I want to talk about are just some general misconceptions that we have about language proficiency and reading and how those misconceptions affect how we teach and how we test reading. And there's a little bit of coals to Newcastle about this in this room. Because classical education, I hope this is coals to Newcastle. You don't merely teach reading as an isolated skill, whether you realize it or not. Classical education cultivates a broad knowledge base necessary for deep reading comprehension. We'll explore a little bit about why that approach is so effective. But mostly what I want to do is demonstrate that without attending to what children learn, to curriculum, which is what I work on, that our concerns about reading achievement in this country, as we just saw with the NAEP scores a couple of weeks ago, that'll go from an acute to a chronic condition, but it'll never go away. But I'm going to begin by just contextualizing my own, if you'll indulge me, my own journey through all of this. So until about 20 years ago or so, this was my life. It was alluded to in that lovely introduction. I had this wonderful life in the warm bosom of corporate America. I ran the public affairs department at Time Magazine, at Business Week. I had an office, had an expense account, remember those? Indoor work, no heavy lifting. It was lovely. And then one day, I was seduced by this ad on the New York City subway system. Anybody from New York here? Okay. This is a program called the New York City Teaching Fellows. I like to joke it was Teach for America for people who couldn't get into Teach for America, like me. It was ostensibly for mid-career professionals. What that meant was not, I was almost 40 years old, but mid-career professional turns out you were 24 years old and had one job. I was the grand old man of the New York City Teaching Fellows. So anyway, this subway ad said, you remember your first grade teacher's name, who will remember yours? And I was just hooked. I was, going to single-handedly close the achievement gap all by myself. So I signed up for the program, 6 weeks of teacher boot camp, and then this was my life. That is PS 277 in the South Bronx. And since you don't know New York, I will explain the context for you here. New York City, obviously the largest school district in the country by a considerable margin. At the time, over 1 million kids, just about the same size now. So PS 277 is in the South Bronx. The South Bronx is District 7. If you're having Hunger Games images in your minds, it's not far from true. So District 7, the South Bronx, was 20 years ago and still is the lowest scoring district in New York City. That school, it was the lowest scoring and still is the lowest scoring school in District 7. So just conjure in your mind that jarring transition from corporate America to, a couple of months later, teaching fifth grade in literally, by definition, the lowest of the low schools in New York City. What does that look like? Well, it looks like that. The test scores the year I started at PS 277 showed that 16% of the previous year's fourth graders, my now fifth graders, were at or above grade level in reading. And by the way, at the time, the cut scores, the testing was so debased that 16% is nothing to be It's even worse than it sounds. Put it another way, 4 out of 5 of my kids could not read, right? Now, having rarely set foot in an elementary school since I was myself an elementary school student, 30 years earlier, I assumed that my classroom would be filled with kids who literally could not read. Like you put text in front of them and they would not be able to do what I now know to call, and we all know to call, decoding. That is not what I found. So I spent 5 years teaching at PS 277, lowest of the low, heart of the poorest congressional district in America. Every single student, black or brown, every single student on free or reduced price lunch. I never had a single student who could not do this. They could all decode, right? Some more fluently than others, but they could all read. What they couldn't do was comprehend. This was a phenomenon that I quickly came to learn was fairly common. All of us, I'm sure, who have been teachers, and especially in elementary school, have had that struggling student who said, what? Well, I read it, but I didn't get it. That's what reading failure obviously looks like in schools like where I was teaching. So yes, there are some number of non-readers, non-decoders, but there are far, far more who read it but don't get it. Well, why don't they get it? Well, when I became a teacher, I learned another word that I'd never heard as an elementary school teacher, and that was a student, and that was metacognition, which means what? Thinking about thinking. I was taught and trained to believe that the reason only 16% of my kids could pass the New York State 5th grade or 4th grade test was because they were not working metacognitively. They were not thinking about their thinking while they were reading. They were not sufficiently trained in metacognitive reading strategies. You see, when good readers read, they do these things. They question the author. They think about their purpose in reading. They connections and text-to-world connections. The idea, at least as I was trained, is that if kids learn to connect unfamiliar words and ideas to familiar words and ideas, well, then they can make sense of just about anything that's put in front of them. At least that's how I was trained. I remember thinking, because again, it'd been a long time since I'd been in elementary school, that's kind of strange. When I read, I'm not thinking about my thinking. I'm thinking about what I'm reading. It did not, none of this resembled how I was taught to read 30 odd years before that, almost 40. But frankly, I don't remember having any explicit reading instruction at all. It was a classic thing in early childhood of first you learn to read and then you read to learn. But there was, the undeniable, and I thought to myself, well, look, things have changed. They've learned something. So clearly we're more sophisticated about teaching reading. But then there was the fact of those test scores, right? If we knew how to teach kids to read, why were only 16% of them passing? But anyway, in my grad school classes in professional development, I'd ask questions about this. And if my students are struggling to understand simple text, aren't they also going to struggle to know which of these strategies to use or to remember to use them at all? How can a child follow the text of a book? The general thrust of a book when we force them to stop every few seconds and write down their metacognitive strategies and their observations and their predictions on Post-it notes. Have any of you ever taught with these strategies? I mean, the kids' books after a while, they kind of look like unmade beds. They're just crammed full of sticky notes. To make a long story short, I just became kind of curious about all this, about the way I was taught to teach reading comprehension to my struggling students. It just didn't make sense to me. Eventually, and on my own, I discovered the work of E.D. Hirsch Jr., who was the founder of the Core Knowledge Foundation. And he had written articles and books about background knowledge and reading comprehension and language proficiency, how a lack of common shared knowledge makes it difficult for kids, especially like low-income students like mine in the South Bronx, to understand even simple text. It all made perfect sense. It was like a hammer through glass for me. This was the one guy, I've said this 1,000 times, it was as if he was in my classroom, the way he would describe reading difficulties. Forget Homer, Plato, Augustine, forget the trivium. My kids never had a day of history or geography. They rarely had art or music at this school, very little science. They knew almost nothing about life beyond 149th Street in the South Bronx. One of my level 4s, one of my highest students, I discovered one day that she was under the misimpression that New Jersey was a different country. And whenever I tell that story, I always point out she was not being ironic. Like she literally thought that New Jersey, she didn't understand that there was this thing called the United States and New Jersey was another state. So what were we doing about this at this school to remediate this lack of common knowledge? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. We weren't concerned about it at all. In fact, I wish I had $1 for every time one of my colleagues would say something like, oh, sure, all that history and science and stuff, that's important. But first, we need to teach the kids how to read. Well, it doesn't work that way. Unless kids have broad background knowledge, they'll never be strong readers. They cannot. So let's talk for a few minutes about reading, how we teach it, how it's assessed. Understanding this is just so critical for children, and those of us who bear the burden of trying to improve outcomes for kids, I will argue, have to put this kind of front and center on our agenda, particularly if we work with disadvantaged kids. So I will share what, in retrospect, I wish somebody had told me as a new teacher, what I regard as maybe the 5 most important things for at least an elementary school teacher to know, which is this: reading is not a skill. I know that's a counterintuitive statement because we think of reading as a skill. We think of it probably like, think right now about your own reading. You probably regard it as akin to riding a bike or throwing a ball. Once you learn how to ride a bike, it's not like you have to learn how to ride a new bike. You just, your skill of riding the bike transfers to every bike that you want to ride. Same thing with reading, right? Some of us may read faster or slower, more fluently, but when you think about your ability to read, if you think about it at all, you probably perceive it as a transferable skill. Doesn't matter if you're reading a novel, a newspaper, a syllabus, memo from your boss. Reading is reading is reading. Either you can do it or you can't. Well, that view of reading is only partially correct. The ability to translate symbols into sounds, decoding, that is a skill. I can prove that to you. Would some brave soul like to read these words out loud? They're nonsense words. And please, ma'am, go ahead. And as she's reading them, just see if you agree or disagree with her pronunciation. Go ahead. Any disagreement? Okay, pop quiz. Put an E at the end of turbot. How did she do that? These words do not exist. Just made up. And there's no disagreement about any of that, right? Fascinating. We've mastered the code. Not only have we mastered the code, the chances are also pretty good that you've also internalized a lot about language structures as well. Here's the first line of a poem that you will recognize as Jabberwocky. "'Twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe." Pop quiz. What are the nouns? Brillig, toves. Yeah, wabe. What part of speech are gyre and gimble? How do we know that? Isn't that amazing? So you're so talented with decoding and language structure that not only could you read nonsense words, you can even identify their parts of speech when used in a sentence. So these are transferable skills, right? But reading is not about decoding. It's not even about the language structure. It's about comprehension. Comprehension is not a transferable skill, and I'll give you simple proof of that. We are in the city where the Los Angeles Angels play their spring training game. So here's a sentence for you. Trout grounded into a 6-4-3 double play to end the game. I'm looking around the room and I'm seeing a lot of blank faces. I'm seeing 1 or 2 knowing nods. Most of you have no idea what this means and you're trying to parse it and you're thinking, let me guess, a trout? Well, that's a fish. So maybe this is from a children's book. But if you're a baseball fan, and any baseball fans in the room that would like to interpret this for us? Okay, if you're a baseball fan, who won this game? Not the Angels, because Mike Trout, who's the player for the Angels, if you ground into a 2-4-3 or 6-4-3 double play to end the game, you lost. What this means is that Mike Trout of the Angels got up in probably the ninth inning, man on first base, hits a ground ball to the shortstop, who threw the ball to the second baseman, who threw the ball to the first baseman, game over. And the rest of you are thinking, what? It says that? Well, if you've never heard of Mike Trout, if you don't know what a 6-4-3 double play is, if you can't reconstruct this game situation, I promise you, you did not suddenly become a bad reader. You just lack the specific knowledge of baseball. to fill in the gaps. Here's a little great books. There's Mike Trout right there. Here's some great books of humor for you. Interestingly, you may not have even had to have read The Scarlet Letter to get this joke. As long as you have enough of what E.D. Hirsch calls cultural literacy, you get the joke. If not, you read it, but you didn't get it. Here's another similar cultural literacy joke. Here's a great line from Groucho Marx. What do you get when you cross an insomniac, an agnostic, and a dyslexic, someone who stays up all night wondering if there's a dog? Think for a moment about the ridiculous amount of background knowledge and vocabulary that you need to make sense of this basically one-liner. Groucho Marx assumed that you, and you did, that you would have the vocabulary and background knowledge to fill in the gaps. The joke just loses its punch if you have to explain what all these things mean. I've joked for years that we should have an organization called Stand-Up Comedians for Background Knowledge, because otherwise the punchline of almost every joke would be, well, you're just going to have to Google it. Remember that cursive knowledge game. Writers assume that readers know things. When you don't, meaning breaks down. And this is the hardest thing in the world for educated people to wrap their head around, is just how easily and fluidly, automatically, you fill in the gaps. Let me give you an example of how hard it can be to make meaning, however, when knowledge is missing. Take 30 seconds and read this passage. A little bit awkward and strange, I grant you. So now this passage was part of an experiment in reading recall. Some people who read, I think the way the experiment worked is they had undergraduate students read this passage and then 20 minutes later go back and answer reading comprehension questions about it. Some people who read this paragraph had a very, very hard time with this experiment, very, very hard time with the comprehension. Others in the experiment had a very easy time, however. But wait, I forgot to mention why those who did not struggle with this, they had one little advantage, and it was this. See, the difficulty with this passage has nothing to do with text complexity, with reading level. Every sentence by itself is pretty simple. The difficulty comes in trying to combine the sentences into a coherent story. But the people in the experiment who were told it was about washing clothes had a much higher recall. It's because they had a mental model now that helped them make sense of this otherwise unusual paragraph. It just made it stickier. So context matters. That's the moral of the story. But ultimately, when we teach reading, we teach what? We teach decoding. We teach reading strategies. Frankly, this is my biggest fear about the science of reading movement. Let me be clear. I'm a fan. I'm a Emily Hanford fanboy. Delighted by the science of reading movement. I'm looking at what state legislatures are doing, passing bills insisting that colleges of education have to train teachers in it. Great. They're banning things like 3Qing. In New York City, where I started my career, they have finally, after a quarter century, thrown out Lucy Calkins. They have now adopted 3 different early literacy curriculums, and they are mandating that schools, including the one where I used to work, must use one of these 3 science of reading-based curriculum. Mazel tov, as my people do not say. So why am I nervous? Because I've been in this work long enough to see the fad-driven nature of education policy and practice. If the science of reading is perceived as just do phonics, it will fail. And then all those discredited ideas about reading will come rushing right back into our schools. So my hope, frankly, resides with you all in the classical schools movement. My hope resides with structured, cumulative curriculum rooted in the liberal arts tradition. The rich content that kids in classical schools get. That ensures that students are constantly building background knowledge. I'm counting on the burgeoning classical schools movement to show the way to K-12 education at large. Because if we do what happened in my old school, if we narrow curriculum, if it's all mirrors, no windows, or when you take out literature and science and history and art and music, the full rich knowledge that literate people possess and take for granted, That's how you get that "I read it, but I didn't get it" phenomenon. So reading comprehension, making meaning out of text, is not an all-purpose how-to skill that you practice and learn. That's what I meant when I said reading is not a skill. Yes, you need knowledge and vocabulary. Yes, you need to be able to decode. You need to know most of the words, but you need the background knowledge to make meaning. But that's just not the way, even now, as we're having this burgeoning science of reading movement in this country, it's still, these bad practices that I've been describing are still, I think, the dominant form of education. Because we are, for whatever reason, in American K-12 education, we are somewhat either uncomfortable or even anti-knowledge. What is it about that? Why are we anti-knowledge? Think about some of these things that we hear as teachers all the time, and maybe even some of you still say these things. Mere facts aren't important. We should stress critical thinking. I'm seeing knowing smiles. The goal of education is to learn how to learn. Teach students to think. You can always look up information, especially true in the era of Google and AI, right? Well, these are some of my favorite homilies. I like to call these education homilies because, we don't think about them, we just recite them. And they sound so sensible, right? I mean, you can really just look things up, can't you? Not really. The default mode of reading the instruction in our schools, broadly speaking, again, is learn how to decode, practice learning strategies, and then you can read just about anything. Well, let's see if it works. Here's another piece of text. This one I stole directly from E.D. Hirsch Jr. out of one of his books. Take 10 or 15 seconds and read that, and then we will try using our reading strategies. Okay, so let's attack this the way that we teach kids to attack a challenging text. Let's use reading strategies. Let's determine the author's purpose. Okay, well, let's see. This is clearly an account of a cricket match. Since he's talking about wickets, the author is trying to tell us the purpose, what happened in a game played by the Australian cricket team. Maybe the only person in the room who actually understands this passage is Helen Baxendale. Maybe it will help if we make a text-to-world connection. Okay, well, we understand baseball. Cricket's kind of like baseballs. Is that helping your comprehension? No, not mine either. Visualization is a reading strategy. I've put a helpful picture there for you to help you visualize this. Does any of this help you make sense of this? Let's try this reading strategy. It was my favorite one. Question the author. Okay, does anybody have a question for the author? Because I have a question for the author. My question is, what the hell are you talking about? I know all the words. I understand the broad context. I'm reasonably well educated. I could apply reading strategies until the sun goes out, and I will never understand this passage. Why? Because I lack the domain knowledge of the game of cricket. By the way, you can do this yourself at home. Try reading, if at least based on my domain knowledge, try reading like a new product warranty or instructions for like installing an operating system on your computer, a college level text in a subject you've never studied, and you'll start to feel what it's like to be that struggling fourth grader. You might put your finger on the text, you'll read and reread. You might even have your lips start to move as you're reading. You didn't become a bad reader. You're just not reading in a domain that you're familiar with. By the way, I should say a few words about reading strategies because I get called on this. As recently as this morning, I'm accused of saying reading strategies have no value. They have some value. Dan Willingham, who's a cognitive scientist at the University of Virginia, if you don't know his work, you should. He's pointed out that it's not that reading strategies don't work, but there's just limited payback to repeated practice of them. In a way, a reading strategy is almost like if you think when you're having a conversation with somebody, if they say something you don't understand, you kind of do this and then they explain. A reading strategy is sort of like a workaround for print. But the key thing about reading strategies is that once students understand how to use them, there's further repetition and practice does not yield any benefit. So after a while, there's like an opportunity cost. If you're continuing to practice them, and we never stop practicing them in my old school, well, then there's an opportunity cost because the time that I'm spending on these strategies with limited payback is time I'm not spending, reading history, literature, science, art, music. It's just sucking up too much of the school day. So again, I want to be clear on this because I don't want to be accused of this anymore. I'm not saying strategies are complete and total nonsense. They're just of limited utility. The power of background knowledge in reading comprehension provides context and resolves ambiguities. And here's what I mean by that. Even familiar words can be unfamiliar in a different context. So think about the word shot. That means something very, very different in a doctor's office, on a basketball court, on a rifle range, in a bar. Every pun, if you think about it, is a shift in context. So, Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. Yes, he fell from a great height, but if in a different context, maybe he was just enjoying some really nice, crisp autumn weather. So, again, at the risk of beating this to death, reading is not a skill. Decoding is a skill. Reading comprehension is not a skill that we teach. It's a condition we create. And there's no mystery, right? Why affluent children are better readers. They come to us on day one with more background knowledge, bigger vocabularies. They're more likely to have traveled, visited museums, they have rich dinner table conversations with their parents. There was a wonderful book 20 years ago called Unequal Childhood by a woman named Annette Leroux. And she had a phrase for this called concerted cultivation. She described this as a parenting style common among middle class and upper class families where parents actively structure their children's lives with organized activities. They encourage reasoning and negotiation. They engage in continuous verbal development. She argued that concerted cultivation gives children advantages in settings like schools by fostering verbal skills. So our job, if we're working with disadvantaged kids, is to try to close that gap. But it's not like those other things go away. The kids that I taught in the South Bronx, by contrast, I would describe them as school-dependent learners. If they don't learn it at school, then they often don't learn it at all. And I cannot overstate how critical this is for closing that so-called achievement gap. There's even a name for this. It's called the Matthew effect. And this is another room where you're going to know this. This is great. Not at least the Bible passage. The term the Matthew effect has been used to describe what happens when kids come to school with smaller vocabularies and less of a knowledge base than their peer. It comes from this passage in the Gospel of Matthew. For unto everyone that hath shall be given, and he shall have abundance, but from him that hath not shall be taken away even that which he hath. Which in plain English means what? The rich get richer, the poor get poorer. And they do. Those who are poor in vocabulary grow poorer still. Those who are rich in knowledge have what they need to grow richer still. Think for a moment about how we learn new words. Vocabulary really is destiny. A typical college freshman has a working vocabulary of about 60,000 words, depending on how you count. That's an extraordinarily large number. So do the math on that for a second. In order to get to a 60,000 word vocabulary by age 18, that would mean you would need to learn 10 words a day, 70 per year, over 3,000, or 70 per week, 3,300 per year. And that is assuming you'd learn your first 10 words in the delivery room, which obviously doesn't happen. So where does that language growth come from? Well, the more words you know, the faster you acquire new words. The rich get richer. You acquire them indirectly and in context. Let me demonstrate. So here is a word that, because we're all excellent decoders, we can probably read, excrescence, but I'm guessing most people are unfamiliar with. That's why I love this word. I don't expect you to know the definition of this word, but I will give it to you in a sentence, and you can figure it out. To calculate fuel efficiency, the aerospace engineers needed an accurate estimation of excrescence drag caused by the shape of the plane's cabin. I'm just looking at faces to see who's nodding and whatnot. I'll give you another sentence. Excrescences on the valve of the heart have been known to cause strokes. Okay, now I'm seeing a few more nods. I'll give you one more to test your theory of what this word means. The wart, a small excrescence on his skin, had made Jeremy self-conscious for years. So by now you probably have a pretty solid understanding of the word. one more sentence should allow you to nail it, to verify your understanding. At the far end of the meadow was what at first glance I thought was a huge dome building, and then I saw was an excrescence, from the cliff itself. Okay, so you've probably figured out, if you did not already know, here's the definition, that excrescence means a projection or outgrowth, especially something that's outnormal, something that sticks out. That's an accelerated example of how most of our word learning occurs. You get a general sense of the word that the reader gains from experiencing it kind of in the wild. It's not fixed, it's not definite, but it gets refined over time, narrowed down every time you encounter that new word. But this is what I wanted to, and maybe I can go back. Think of all the prior knowledge that you had that allowed you to learn that new word. So I didn't explain to you what an aerospace engineer was, what drag was, a plane's cabin. I didn't explain to you what a stroke is, or what heart valves are. I assumed you knew, and you did, what it means to feel self-conscious. I didn't explain to you what meadows were and what cliffs were. I assumed you knew, and you did. So because you knew all those things, you learned a new word. If you didn't know those things, you would not have learned those words. You would have fallen a little bit further behind. That's the Matthew effect. This is just profoundly important, and it gets to the heart of our struggle to improve reading comprehension, especially for disadvantaged kids. If you don't make education as content-rich and robust as possible, that dreaded Matthew effect just takes hold and it does not let go. They're going to forever not learn to read with understanding. They will read it, but they will not get it. Dan Willingham, who I invoked a few minutes ago, has a wonderful phrase for this, for all of this. He says, teaching content is teaching reading. Why? Because reading is what cognitive scientists like Willingham would describe as, quote, domain specific. You need to know a little bit about the subject and sometimes a lot about the subject to understand it. The same thing, by the way, is true about creativity, critical thinking, problem solving. All of these high goals that we have for education are knowledge dependent. But how many times have you heard those homilies, that we're going to teach? We're not going to teach mere facts. We're going to focus on skills like critical thinking, creativity, and problem solving. It just doesn't work that way. My favorite example of this, there was a paper written some years ago. I wish I could remember the author's name. It was titled, "Could Steven Spielberg Manage the Yankees?" I guess I love my baseball analogies. The short answer is no. I mean, he's a genius, a creative genius, but he's a creative genius filmmaker. There's no reason to believe that what makes him good in one domain would translate into or transfer into the dugout of Yankee Stadium. There's no such thing as an all-purpose genius or critical thinker. Those skills are domain specific. And I'll give you one more study to prove this to you. And by the way, this study has become better well known thanks to Emily Hanford. So forgive me if you already know this one, but years ago, this was the hammer through glass for so many people. So there was this well-known study that looked at junior high school students who were either good readers or poor readers based on standardized test scores. And the researchers divided them into two groups, half of whom were good readers, half of whom were poor groups, and then within poor readers. And then within those groups, there were some who knew a lot about baseball, some who knew a little. So if you think about it, there's four groups. Good readers who know baseball, good readers who do not know baseball, poor readers who know baseball, poor readers who do not know baseball. And then they very cleverly gave them a reading passage about baseball, and the researchers would stop them every few seconds to say, okay, illustrate on this diamond, on this model, what is happening in the game. Now, if reading was a skill, if reading comprehension was a skill, the way we test it, the way we teach it, what should have happened? Well, the good readers should do what good readers always do. They should have blown it away. The poor readers should have struggled. It's not what happened. So the good readers who did not know baseball got 18 on average, 18.8 out of 40 correct. The ostensible poor readers who did know baseball, 27.5 out of 40 correct. So if reading comprehension was a transferable skill, this should not have happened. The poor readers with high content knowledge outperformed the putative good readers. Now, if this makes you question who is a good reader and who is a bad reader, well, that's exactly the point. Who is more likely to get a good score on a reading test? Is it the kid who spent the most time practicing strategies and doing practice tests? Or is it the kid who has the broadest base of general knowledge? The way I like to describe this, thinking just about testing for a second, is the reading passages on a test are like a child's game of Jenga, where every block, you know the Jenga game, right? The block tower game. Imagine that game where every block is a little bit of background knowledge or a vocabulary word. And if you've ever played that game with kids, you know you can pull out a few and it's fine. Then what happens? You pull out one too many and the entire thing collapses. They read it, but they don't get it. Let me see how much time I have here. I don't want to. What time are we here until? Till 3. Well, then maybe I should stop. Okay, I should have stopped a long time ago. Is what you're suggesting? Yeah, let's stop and take questions. But I will ask you just as a homework assignment. I was going to show you a couple of minutes, but we may be having trouble with the audio of Obama's first inaugural. Go home and listen to it at some point, because I love to show that speech, not for any political reason, goodness knows, but because it is so, as classical educators, you will appreciate this. It is so filled with allusions to classical literature, biblical references, historical references, and it's almost poignant, where I think about how that event was perceived in my old school. We're like, oh, this is a first. The kids get to see a president who looks like them, and they learn that I can be president, but the speech went so far over their head. Like all these allusions, all these references, and what I like to show that speech and point out is like, there were two ways to look at that speech. The most kids saw novelty. They saw an historic first. Those of us who have had better educations understood the words, all of the words, and it was a much more meaningful event. You could appreciate this historical moment when you could literally understand what this person was saying versus those who were just saying, oh, look, he looks like me. Isn't that wonderful? Which is a nice sentiment, but it's not nearly enough. So my encouragement to teachers is to ensure that you are creating the conditions with students so that when they get to witness an event like that, they really understand it for what it is. But since we have just 20 minutes left, shall we have a conversation?